What is going on, you guys? Today I have another super quick episode for you. So we're going to be reviewing the MOA podcast with Michael Sartain on the left, and he's interviewing Dr. David Buss on the right. And the episode title here is basically what do men and women want from their mates or their partners. Let's get into it.
Dr. Buss, the thing is, for people who are not fully aware of evolutionary psychology or one of the predictable, testable hypotheses, can we talk about the 37 culture study? Because to me, that is sort of like the beginning of where I started to say, oh, wait a second, these ideas that you come up with are pervasive amongst all Homo sapiens, or at least all Homo sapiens that you've checked in. So 37 different cultures, you checked some of the mating strategies, and what were the results that you found?
This was a study of 37 cultures. It took a long time to do this study, by the way. It's a lot easier to do studies nowadays, but at that point, it took about 5 years. And the 37 cultures included huge diversity of political systems, religious orientations, every ethnicity, any dimension you can think of, these cultures varied on, including, let's say, presumptively monogamous cultures versus presumptively polygynous cultures, where one man can legally permitted to marry multiple wives. So what we were interested in this study was, what do men and women want in a long-term mate? And so this initial 37 culture study focused on long-term mate selection, and really it was focused on Darwin's theory of sexual selection. That is, what are the qualities that men and women want in potential partners? Because that influences your selection. Of course, what you want is not always what you can get, as Mick Jagger said, but preferences do drive actual mating decisions. And so what we found is we found some things that were universally desired. So things like good health, intelligence, dependability, mutual attraction, and love. And these were basically universal preferences in all 37 cultures, more or less equally preferred by men and women. We found some characteristics that were highly variable in how much they were desired across cultures. And the most variable was the desire for virginity or chastity, or what we defined it as no prior sexual intercourse.
Yeah, we don't have that in Las Vegas. We're not aware of that.
Right. Yeah. Nor are they in
Austin,
in Austin or Sweden.
In Sweden, yeah. There was not much virginity at UT Austin when I was there. Yes.
Yeah. But what we found is, in mainland China at the time, virginity was an absolute indispensable quality of a long-term mate. And in Sweden, it was like irrelevant. And some even said it was bad. If someone was a virgin, certainly by, say, mid-20s, this was viewed as a weird, quirky, undesirable quality. But what was the most startling to most people was the fact that we found universal sex differences. And the sex differences were precisely the sex differences.
That's kind of interesting, right? Because like most of the time you hear people say like the reverse. Like it's a lot of like podcast bros, right? Like the guys like, oh, they want a girl with less sexual partners, right? So like I'm not sure which gender he was talking about there, where in mainland China they were like, in your mid-20s they were viewing it as weird if you hadn't gotten intimate with someone yet. Because I know that's like a very Western thing, right? Like in the US or Canada, UK, Australia, etc., right? They'd be like, especially between guys, they'd be like, wait, bro, you haven't done it yet? And like a lot of guys are like weird and like insecure about it. By the way, like I totally get it, like because you feel like it's almost like fear of missing out or FOMO, like you're left out. But it's funny, like every time I hear a guy who was like a late bloomer say that he finally, like lost his virginity or whatever, he's always like, yeah, it wasn't really that big of a deal, right? Like it wasn't really all it was cracked up to be. Like everyone made a big deal about it, and it wasn't really like this huge thing. So it's kind of funny hearing those like different perspectives.
Differences predicted in advance by evolutionary hypotheses, and these were anchored in Darwin's theory of sexual selection.
Also, a lot of people will talk about, I don't know if they're going to get into it here, but pair bonding, which is like the concept of like the more sexual partners that you've had, the more difficult it is for you to actually bond with like your potential long-term partner in the future. And I'm not sure the science behind that. Maybe someone can comment on it down below the video. I find that really interesting, like the idea if it's just like a chemical thing or like a biological thing that sort of like prevents people from doing that, if it's actually fully true or not. Because I know, like, again, like a lot of podcast bros like to be like, it only affects women, like, so like they have a bunch of sexual partners, it's going to be hard for them to connect with someone for a long-term thing in the future, like get their actual desired partner, versus like they'll say, and they have like an ego up around it, like, oh no, it doesn't happen to guys, but it definitely does happen to guys too. I'm not sure if it happens at the same extent as it happens for women, because for women, like it's like guys are naturally more logical and less emotional. We both have both, right? But then women are more emotional and less logical. So it's kind of like an interesting concept, at least. So like, if you want, after this video, check out pair bonding, like Google it, and it's an interesting discussion, at least.
Trivers's modification of that in terms of parental investment driving the two components of sexual selection. George C. Williams, the great evolutionary biologist, a conceptualization of reproductive value. And then Don Simons, also a brilliant evolutionary psychologist, who wrote The Evolution of Human Sexuality, 1979, but a brilliant, brilliant book. What we found is that men more than women preferred qualities associated with physical attractiveness, as well as relative youth. And we know now that these are cues to fertility. That is, fertility shows a very sharp age curve in women, peaks around early to mid 20s in our species in women, and then declines after 30, and declines rather steeply after 30. Whereas men's fertility shows a different age distribution, where it also peaks but it shows a very gradual diminution over age. So youth and beauty. And this was in part startling because, I'll mention the other one. And then women more than men preferred characteristics associated with resource acquisition, and qualities linked to resource acquisition, such as social status, ambition, industriousness, and somewhat older age. Like not old geezer age, but guys who were a few years older than they are.
Yeah, so basically what he's saying, right, translation is for women, they want security, like they want to feel protected, right? So the more you're able to do that for them, have this masculine frame, also be able to provide resources, food, shelter, status, right? Like, so like people will respect you, and there's different levels to that, right? I think there's a whole different conversation when it comes to like the celebrity version of that, like the status and their attraction to that, to someone who might actually be like if you can mix the two, like a cocktail of like, assuming the celebrity is a good person, then there's that, right? But let's say there's like the sort of like hedonistic, not so good person, celebrity, versus like someone who has all those qualities, but they're not like famous necessarily. Like maybe they're really well off, maybe they're really in shape, right? Maybe they've got good status within their community. That also works as well. So it's kind of interesting that they're bringing that up. And there's another point he just brought up here too. Let me see.
Fertility shows a different age distribution where...
Oh yeah, well, so with fertility, right? I mean, that's an easy one. Like, I mean, guys can all nod their heads for this one, right? Like, sure, like, everybody wants something a little bit different, but I mean, most guys, if you haven't had a kid yet, right, that's something that's really desirable for you. That's something you want, of course, right? So assuming at your core, that you want to have kids in the future, that's going to be a key determining factor on whether or not you're actually going to continue that relationship with the girl, right? Is, can you have a family together, right? So when her fertility rate drops, around, 35 plus, right? Really, it starts to happen sooner, right? I think people say like 30, 32 or so. That's like why it's so important for guys, and why they talk about dating younger women and not like 35, 40, etc. It's for that specific reason. And it's a whole different conversation when you get into like them talking about like freezing their eggs and in vitro and all this stuff. Like, I'm not going to get into that into this video. But I do find it a bit strange that there's like big companies, I'm pretty sure like Google, and like other big, really popular companies are like basically offering that as an option to like basically like women who have kind of gone like the corporate ladder route. Like you could say like the boss babe route, what do you want to call it, right? Like, I respect the ambition, right? But it's really quite interesting that some of those companies are like offering that as like a benefits package. Like, hey, we're going to help pay for you to like freeze your eggs so you can do that when you're ready, rather than kind of like encouraging them to do it when it's safer for the baby, right? Like they could have the baby earlier when it's, going to be healthier and safer for it to be born, rather than later when it's like a little bit more dangerous for the baby. So it's just an interesting conversation.
These turn out to be universal across all 37 cultures. And what I wish is that I asked people in advance of the study to make predictions, fellow psychologists, sociologists, biologists, and almost all of them predicted that the sex differences would not be universal, that they would be limited to Western cultures or capitalist cultures or media saturated cultures. And so, and then of course, after the results are published, some people came back and said, well, I could have predicted that in advance, but they didn't. And in fact, no one had in the field predicted those in advance, except for the evolution-minded people that I mentioned before. So sorry.
Yeah, just to go back to what we said before. So we started this off by talking about a testable model for some a testable theory. We came up with a testable theory based on evolution. You did 37 different cultures that were independent of each other. The hypothesis that you came from evolutionary studies, and it turned out to be universal sex differences, meaning your hypothesis turned out to be true, which is surprising to a lot of people. And to me, that was the first time where I heard that, and I was like, okay, wait, we might be onto something here. And what happened for me, generally, because I'm sure a lot of people have told you this before, when you first get into evolutionary psychology and you apply it to certain parts of your life, you're like, oh, this makes sense. Then when you come to this belief that evolutionary psychology is probably where most human preferences and most human behavior comes from, and you apply that to your life, and all of a sudden that makes sense also. Then when it becomes like pretty much all of your decisions, for me, I'm yet to find a situation where it doesn't make sense. Does that make sense? I'm still trying to, like, it's almost like testing the law of gravity, and you keep waiting for it to fail, and it doesn't. That's how I feel about evolutionary psychology. And so I have my own coaching program, and one of the rules I have is that evolutionary psychology explains all human behavior, right? That's one of them, and that was one of the, it seems like the framework that when you wrote the foreword for Dr. Gadsad's book, that seems to be like something that you said, that all psychology is evolutionary psychology.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. So to take them in the order in which you presented them, the results could have turned out differently. So the results, they could have shown that, well, there were sexual reversals, or in the Zulu tribe, which is one of the cultures that we studied, the sex differences were reversed. So the data could have come out in a way that falsified the hypotheses, but they did not. They supported the hypotheses. But you're absolutely right. I think that there's, as I said, there's no such thing as a non-evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
And so, but it all boils down to the specifics. So, the specific evolutionary lenses that you use to interpret human behavior, and I kind of agree with you on that. I look around and there is culture and there is cultural variability, but we have to keep in mind a couple of things, because some people say that, well, it's explained by culture, not evolution. But first of all, as you alluded to earlier in this podcast, we create cultural products that correspond with our evolved psychology.
Exactly. Yes.
And this is something people don't realize. They think, well, the media and pornography, that these are things that are causing our psychology to be the way it is, as opposed to reflections of psychology. And if you created pornography or made movies that didn't tap into our evolved psychology, they wouldn't be successful. And if you look at the most successful movies, just to take movies for example, they all involve key themes of evolutionary psychology. Mating, mate selection, conflict in mating, parental influence, like Romeo and Juliet, the parents trying to interfere with mateships, birth, death, pregnancy, rivalry, homicide, all these things that cause us to say, wow, this is important stuff. I want to pay attention to it. I want to watch this movie. If it's done well, and so it's true of movies. It's also true of all the great literature. Go back to Shakespeare. Contains all these key themes of evolutionary psychology. So I guess I would agree with you. When I look out in the world and I interpret human behavior, I have all these evolutionary lenses that I interpret it through, that you wouldn't otherwise know how to correctly interpret it. So like even things like, I remember, this is somewhat personal, but in earlier dating days, I took a woman to a party, and she went and was talking to other people. I went and was talking to other people, and I was interacting with this very attractive woman. And she kind of came up, and then we left the party, and she casually mentioned, hey, did you notice that her thighs were heavy? That woman you were talking to. And I hadn't noticed it, but what caused me to, next time I saw the woman, I was particularly attentive. Oh, well, it turns out, she was right. Her thighs are heavy. I hadn't noticed it, but it was kind of a fascinating thing in verbal derogation of competitors. And in our studies, we found precisely that women tended to derogate other women on their physical attributes as well as their sexual promiscuity.
That's incredible. Travis, I got David Buss to tell a dating story. I'm so happy right now. You have no idea.
Awesome, guys. Well, yeah, definitely interesting there. That's a good point that he brought up at the end, was girls are really notorious for this, by the way, right? Like if you're dating a girl, you're basically showing pre-selection, right? Like, so you're walking around with a girl, you're on a date with her, or your boyfriend and girlfriend, whatever. Girls notice other girls looking, more than you notice other girls looking, right? They're like a lot more attentive to it, because guys, they like turn their head all the way around, like, oh, there's that cute girl, right? But girls are very more like, they kind of like dart their eyes real quick, like you wouldn't even notice unless you're like hyper attentive. But the girls are like a lot more attuned to that, so they'll see like, oh, did you see that girl checking you out, or did you see the way that girl was acting around you, like she was flirting with you, right? And you know, some guys can kind of pick it up a little bit, but like they have a lot of like subtle cues. So that's funny that she brought that up. Was like, it wasn't necessarily like an attraction cue necessarily, but I think the reason she brought it up was because she noticed like, oh, maybe that girl was interested in you. So girls are pretty funny about that kind of stuff. And another thing he mentioned, I like that he was talking about like being able to predict human behaviors, basically on evolutionary psychology, like, oh, they did that because of this, right? Like that's the reason that it led them to this particular decision. So that leads into like, of course, the like the social proof, like girl sees you with another girl, now she's naturally more interested in you, right? That's predictable. He mentioned something super interesting about like the Zulu tribe. I heard it in a different podcast. I forget which one, but they were talking about how like there was a tribe where there was like not any technology or not much technology, and someone introduced one of the men to a smartphone, right? And immediately it like destroyed all of his dopamine sensors. And then they introduced him to like the smartphone with adult entertainment on it, and his brain was just like getting destroyed, right? So of course they took it away, right? Because he wasn't used to that, and the whole tribe wasn't. But that's just like absolutely crazy to think about, right? It's like, you can kind of predict that would happen based on what's happening to people today who use those technologies, right? So it's interesting. Like it was like a crash course just given it to this guy who had like no technology beforehand, or hadn't seen adult entertainment beforehand. It's just like, you kind of get like your brain warped a little bit. But anyways, this is a very interesting episode. I like both of these guys. They have interesting perspectives to share. So check out Michael Sartain and David Buss. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Like, comment, subscribe. You got this, bro.